This leads us to one of the more important concepts in ecology. There is a continuum of life history strategies, ranging on one extreme from species where individuals have very high fecundity but very low survivorship, and to the other extreme where individuals tend to have very low fecundity and very high survivorship. Obviously, what you'd ideally like, if you were an organism, is to have high fecundity and high survivorship. But there are reasons why, really, you can't have both at once. At least you can't maximize both at once. There's a strong trade-off between these two things. And so what you end up having is you have different species that tend to specialize on this end of the spectrum or this end of the spectrum. There are some right here in the middle. You can have individuals that fall at any point along the spectrum, but we generally tend to refer to individuals at one side of the spectrum or the other. And these two ends of the spectrum have special names. So organisms that can reproduce very rapidly, they have lots of offspring, but those offspring tend not to make it to maturity, are called R-selected organisms. They have an R-selected life history strategy. Generally, what's happening with these organisms is they release huge numbers of propagules, potential offspring. That's the spores of this fungus, which come out in the millions. Lots of plants, especially weedy plants, have thousands of tiny little seeds, and they're fast reproducing organisms like this fruit fly that have they lay many eggs. However, the problem is that if you are trying to have many offspring, each offspring has to be small because you've only got so many resources to put into reproduction. And those resources have to be divided by the number of offspring that you're making. So necessarily, making more offspring, given a certain amount of resources, means making smaller offspring. And making smaller offspring means making offspring that are less likely to survive, especially if there's competition for resources. Okay, because these spores are extremely tiny, for example. And if they do not land in a place where they happen to have enough resources to build an entire fungal body, they are going to die. The same thing goes for tiny seeds from weedy plants and the offspring of animals that make small eggs. They will need resources as soon as they are born or they will not survive. And so if they're placed, if they happen to find themselves in a location where they don't have access to a lot of resources, they're not going to make it. So survivorship past the first stage of life in our selected organisms tends to be very low. At the other extreme, you have organisms that invest a tremendous amount in each offspring, and that investment is generally energy and nutrients, but it can also be parental care. Okay, these are all resources that have to be divided up among as many offspring as you have, and for some organisms the strategy is to have very few offspring. However, because each offspring starts life out with a lot of resources, they tend to be good competitors. You can put one of these newborn organisms in an environment where there's lots of competition for resources, and they're pretty likely to survive because they already have a lot of resources. They were born with a lot of resources. And so they tend to be able to survive even where the pickings are slim, and there are lots of individuals in the environment competing for resources. Okay, so a corollary of these two life history strategies is that our selected organisms tend to be really inefficient with resources because they're focused on speed. They're focused on growing up very rapidly and making many offspring. These are speed specialists. K-selected organisms are competition specialists. And because of that, they tend to have evolved to be very efficient with resources. That tends to make them better competitors. But because they're efficient with resources and they're usually found where competition is fierce, they mature very slowly. So on the one hand, we've got short generation time, small size and maturity, fast growth, I guess I said that was short generation time, small offspring, low survival rate. And here we have long generation time, slow growth to maturity, late age of first reproduction, large individuals, large offspring that tend to have high survivorship. Okay, all of those traits tend to cluster together. Okay, and this is one of the probably the most important dichotomies in ecology, is that you have some individuals that specialize on speed, and you have some species that specialize on speed, and you have some species that specialize on efficiency and competition. Okay, there is another aspect of life history that I want to talk about. There are different ways of having offspring, or rather, there are different numbers of times that you can have offspring. Many organisms are what are called semiparous organisms, and this means that during their lifespan there's only one reproductive event. This is also referred to as Big Bang reproduction, because these organisms pour all of their resources into reproducing once, and then they die. So for example, annual plants are plants that only live 1 year. At the end of that growing season, they set seed and the adult plant dies. There are a lot of plants that are like this, especially weedy plants. Many insects only survive for 1 season. Salmon as well swim upstream, they reproduce once, and then die at the source of the stream where they were born. So this is actually a surprisingly common strategy to basically put all your eggs in one reproductive basket. The reproductive strategy that we're much more familiar with, because it's what we do, is called iteroparity. Iteroparous organisms don't reproduce until they reach some initial age of first reproduction, but then they can have multiple reproductive events during their lifetime, assuming they survive that long. Okay, perennial plants are ones that continue growing and reproducing year after year. Most of the animals that we're familiar with are iteroparous. That is, if they survive from one breeding season to the next, they do have the possibility of having more than one reproductive event. Why do some organisms use iteroparity? They reproduce multiple times, whereas some use simiparity. Basically, it's a gamble. So let's compare what happens when you've got 2 alleles that are present in a population. Let's suppose that one of the alleles makes a plant simiparous and the other makes a plant iteroparous. And let's suppose that mortality is at about 50% per year. In other words, every plant in this population, once it reaches reproductive age, it has a 50% chance of surviving the winter to the next year. So what happens with both of these strategies? Well, plants with the simiparous allele will blow their wad in the first year. They have 250 seeds and then they die. Let's suppose that iteroparous plants have 100 seeds the first year. They don't have 250 because they have to save a lot of their resources. They have to invest in a lot of their resources in their body in order to survive the winter. The second year, obviously, this plant is not going to have any offspring. Okay, these plants can have 100 seeds the second year. Any plant that survives will have 100 seeds the second year, but only half of them are going to survive. So on average, each one of these iteroparous plants will only have 50 seeds in year 2. Okay, the cost of mortality keeps increasing. Only 25% of the iteroparous plants will make it to have seeds the third year, and so on average, an iteroparous plant can only expect to have 25 in its third year, and so on. So for the iteroparous plant, these are the average payoffs each year that it can expect to get. If you add those up, they only add up to 200 seeds. what this means is that if you've got similparous alleles and iteroparous alleles in the same population, similparous alleles are going to outcompete iteroparous alleles, and this species is going to evolve to be similparous. Okay, but let's change the parameters a little bit. Let's suppose that instead of having 50% mortality each year, you have only 30%. That means that each iteroparous plant that makes it to reproductive age can expect to have 70 seeds the second year, 50 the next, 35 the next, and so on. And when you add up those lifetime payoffs for being iteroparous, each iteroparous plant can expect to have 340 seeds over its lifetime. That's a lot more than 250. Okay? I mentioned that basically these two strategies are essentially gambles. What the iteroparous plant is gambling on is surviving to the next year. And in situations where that gamble pays off, where survivorship from one year to the next really is pretty high, natural selection is going to favor iteroparity. Okay? When the likelihood of surviving to the next year is very poor, it's best to cash in your chips early and use similparity, because then you get whatever payoff you're going to get right away. You don't have to count on surviving to get more. So that's one of the factors that tips the balance in favor of iteroparity versus similparity. If your chance of surviving to the next year is really good, then that tends to favor iteroparity. If your chance of surviving the next year are really bad, that tends to favor similparity. The other thing you have to keep in mind is the trade-off between reproduction now and investing in the body now. In other words, how many seeds is it going to cost this iteroparous plant to survive the winter? How much of its reproductive resources does it have to invest in its soma, its body, in order to survive to the next reproductive season? If that amount is really low, well, that's going to tend to favor iteroparity. So for example, if it didn't cost very much to survive the winter, this number here might be 200, and this would be 150, 25, and so on. Okay, so reducing the cost of keeping yourself alive to the next year also favors iteroparity. On the other hand, if the cost of keeping yourself alive to the next year is very high, that's really going to favor similparity because it makes your future payoff it makes your total payoff much, much lower. So keep that trade-off in mind. This trade-off really influences the advantage of similparity versus iteroparity. The probability of survival from one breeding season to the next also really influences the benefits of similparity versus iteroparity. As with a lot of things in evolution and ecology, the trade-off between similparity and iteroparity can be thought of as an economic decision, essentially a decision about investments. So there's a certain reproductive gain to taking one strategy. There's a certain reproductive gain to taking another strategy. You can either put resources into surviving into the future in hopes of getting future payoffs, or you can cash in all your chips now and get as many offspring as you can now, but then sacrifice all future possibilities. So, and the optimal gamble, the optimal strategy is going to differ in different circumstances. But this is the way you generally have to think about it, is you can only invest resources in the future or in reproduction now. Some very counterintuitive reproductive strategies, like those of salmon, which swim upstream and spawn and then die, actually do make a lot of sense when viewed through this lens. The odds of making it through to another breeding season for the salmon is so low that it simply doesn't make sense for them to invest what's necessary in their bodies to make it through to that next opportunity. There are some other factors that tend to favor semal parity, investing everything you've got in reproduction now. This is a great example. This is this remarkable inflorescence group of flowers is from a yucca plant that grows in the mountains of California. And the interesting thing about this plant is that the more that it puts into reproduction in one inflorescence, in one flowering stalk, the more of a payoff it gets in terms of reproductive success. This is because these taller stalks get a lot more attention from pollinators. So that by just increasing the height of this inflorescence by a few inches, this yucca increases its reproductive success by a considerable amount, enough to make the payoff worthwhile, even if it's using the last resources it has, or the resources that it could have used, in other words, to survive to the next year. The other circumstance that you often see for organisms that are simiparous is if there really just isn't much of an opportunity to make it to the next breeding season. I study mayflies in California, and these organisms are famous for having this very short lifespan, which ends with big bang reproduction. They would have to invest so much in their bodies to survive the entire winter to another breeding season that it simply doesn't make sense. A lot of insects, because they are relatively fragile as adults, invest in all the reproduction they can get now, even if it means their immediate death. In general, trade-offs are what really matters in the evolution of life histories. Obviously, if it weren't for trade-offs, every organism would live as long as it could and have as many offspring as it could at every single possible life stage. That doesn't happen because of the trade-offs that constrain where those organisms invest their limited resources. There are a few in particular that are very interesting to note. I've already talked about the fact that early fecundity tends to be favored by natural selection over later survival or fecundity. And this leads to some very interesting patterns. So for example, in experiments with fruit flies, what researchers have done is they've artificially selected individuals that live for a long time. What they've done is taken a population of fruit flies, they wait until almost all of them have died, and then they breed the few that are left. The next generation, they wait until almost all of them have died of old age, and they breed the few that are left, and so on. And until they get fruit flies that live for a much, much longer time. But those individuals have poorer fecundity, much poorer, in fact. The egg production of the line that's selected for reproduction at old age is considerably lower when the flies are young. Which means that if they're out in the wild, if they're not being basically bred for old age, these individuals would not be competitively successful against these individuals. In contrast, individuals that are selected for reproducing at a young age tend to have a much higher fecundity at young age. But basically, this is the trade-off here. If you have long life, it costs you something in terms of your fecundity early on. If you have high fecundity early on, it costs you something in terms of your lifespan. And this is true for all kinds of organisms, not only organisms that have been under artificial selection, but organisms that are in the wild. Many organisms, when they breed and generate eggs, it shortens their lifespan. This is a seed beetle. For example, it lays eggs on, it's a stored grain pest because it lays eggs on the kind of seeds that human beings like to store and eat. And you can see here that the survival probability is highest for females that are not allowed to breed. Basically, what you're seeing here, this curve is the percentage of individuals that are left alive. And you can see that that stays high longer if they don't breed. If they're allowed to breed but they don't lay eggs, they die a little bit sooner, and if they breed and then do lay eggs, they die a lot sooner. So again, we've got this trade-off between having offspring and surviving. You can't do both, and so evolution will choose one or the other.